The crowd of the Roman Forum bustles with energy. Senators draped in dazzling togas stroll past, merchants haggle over baskets of figs and olives, and soldiers in polished armor stride proudly beneath the Mediterranean sun. But in the shadow of this grandeur, you, the viewer, are not a free Roman citizen, nor even a visiting foreigner. You are a slave. Your body does not belong to you. Your fate could be decided by the tilt of your master's head or the flick of his hand. Every step you take, every morsel of food you eat, every word that passes your lips exists under the constant weight of Roman domination. So, the question is not just what the life of a Roman slave looked like, it's whether you would survive it. The origins of Roman slavery, how you became property. When we think of slavery today, our minds often leap to images shaped by the modern world, the transatlantic slave trade, racial hierarchies, or plantation economies. But in ancient Rome, slavery was both broader and more insidious. It did not discriminate by skin color or ethnicity. It was a fate that could befall almost anyone at any time through war, misfortune, or even birth. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying thought of all. In Rome, nobody was truly safe from the possibility of enslavement. The simplest path into slavery was also the cruelest, to be born into it. Children of slaves inherited their mother's condition automatically, regardless of who their father was. This meant that a slave woman carrying the child of her master, another slave, or even a free Roman, could never give birth to a free child unless her own freedom had first been granted. The cycle was relentless, ensuring that Rome's slave population could perpetuate itself without relying solely on conquest. Imagine opening your eyes for the very first time, only to discover that the world has already decided your status. You would grow up in the household of your master, not as a son or daughter, but as property. Roman law referred to slaves as res, things. Your cries, your laughter, even your first words belonged not to your mother, but to the man who owned her. The bond between parent and child was fragile, for a master could sell children at will, scattering families like livestock. To the Romans, this was not cruelty, it was commerce. Yet by far the greatest source of slaves was Rome's endless appetite for conquest. With every new territory added to the empire's vast dominion, rivers of captives flowed into its markets. The pattern was brutally efficient. Roman legions marched into foreign lands, Gaul, Greece, North Africa, the Near East, and with victory came plunder. Cities were sacked, populations rounded up, and survivors herded together like cattle. Consider the aftermath of the Third Macedonian War in 168 BCE, when Rome defeated King Perseus of Macedon. Historian Livy recounts that as many as 150,000 captives were sold into slavery, flooding markets from Delos to Rome. Entire towns were emptied of life, their inhabitants transformed overnight from citizens into commodities. In 146 BCE, after the destruction of Carthage, the survivors, men, women, and children, were sold en masse. The Roman general Scipio Aemilianus watched flames consume the once mighty city, then profited from its living spoils. To be captured in war was to lose not only your freedom, but your identity. You might have been a soldier one day, a farmer, a mother, or a priest, but once captured, you were stripped naked, chained, and marched in columns to the nearest slave depot. Along the way, many died of exhaustion or despair. Those who survived faced the cruel ritual of the market. Slave markets in Rome were public, bustling, and humiliating theatres of degradation. They were not hidden in shadowy corners, but proudly displayed in city forums and trading ports, reminders of Rome's power over conquered peoples. Buyers roamed the stalls as they would a livestock fair. Slaves stood on platforms or were paraded before potential masters, often naked or half-dressed to reveal their bodies. Wooden placards hung from their necks listing their details, nation of origin, age, language, health, and skill set. A strong Thracian male might be advertised as suitable for agricultural labor. A young Greek girl, educated in letters and music, could be marketed as a tutor or companion. Exotic captives from Africa or the East carried particular appeal, sold at higher prices not for their ability, but for their rarity. Human beings became luxury goods. Roman law required sellers to declare certain defects, epilepsy, runaway attempts, or criminal histories. If a slave turned out to be diseased or unfit for labor, buyers could demand refunds as though they had purchased a faulty piece of equipment. Sellers thus had every incentive to disguise flaws. Teeth were scrubbed with chalk to appear whiter, hair was dyed to mask age, oil was rubbed on skin to make bodies gleam in the sunlight. A sickly slave might be propped up with drugs long enough to pass inspection. For the enslaved, the experience was one of terror and dehumanization. Imagine being forced to stand in the open square of the Roman Forum, a crowd of strangers appraising your body as they would a horse, hands probing your muscles, fingers prying open your mouth to examine your teeth. A master might pinch your arm to test its firmness or slap your thigh to gauge your strength. Others would haggle over you, discussing your fate as though you were a bolt of cloth, and through it all, you remained silent. Any protest would be met with punishment. But not all slaves came from foreign wars or distant lands. Some were Romans themselves, or at least Italians, reduced to slavery through crime or debt. Criminals convicted of severe offences might be condemned to slavery as punishment, their citizenship stripped away alongside their freedom. Debt, too, could lead to enslavement, particularly in the early Republic. A man unable to pay his creditors risked becoming a nexum, a debt slave, forced to work off his obligations under harsh conditions. Though later reforms limited debt bondage, the shadow of financial ruin always lingered. And then there were those who simply vanished. Piracy plagued the Mediterranean for centuries, with raiders seizing coastal villages or even wealthy travelers to sell them into slavery. Before his rise to power, Julius Caesar himself was kidnapped by pirates. He famously joked about crucifying them once freed, a threat he carried out after raising a ransom and returning with a fleet. Yet countless others were not so fortunate. To be seized by pirates was to vanish from one world and reappear in another, stripped of everything you once knew. What makes the Roman system especially chilling is how thoroughly it dismantled personal identity. A Greek scholar, a Jewish farmer, a Celtic warrior, a Roman debtor, once enslaved, all were reduced to the same legal status: property. The Romans codified this with brutal precision. In legal texts, slaves are grouped with animals and tools under the category of res mancipi, objects essential to economic life. Your name could be changed at your master's whim. You might be given a Roman name like Felix, the lucky one, or Fortunata, fortunate, a cruel irony masking the reality of your bondage. In some households, slaves were not permitted personal names at all, referred to only by their function: cook, gardener, nurse. The very language you used to describe yourself was no longer yours. Once captured, there was almost no path back to your old life. Families were torn apart, sold separately to maximize profit. Husbands and wives were split. Children could be taken from their mother's arms and sold across the empire. Even if you survived long enough to be freed, a rare outcome, the life you once knew was gone forever. Rome's system thrived not only on physical domination, but on psychological annihilation. To be enslaved was to be unmade. Daily life between drudgery and terror. Once the humiliating ordeal of the slave market was over and ownership established, the real test began: survival. To be a Roman slave was to live on a razor's edge between routine drudgery and sudden terror. Your daily life depended not on your own choices, but on the whims of your master, the cruelty of overseers, and the sheer luck of where fate had placed you. In this world, the difference between eating bread at a nobleman's table or dying nameless in a quarry was determined not by merit or effort, but by circumstance. For many, service began in the household. A wealthy Roman elite might own dozens, even hundreds of slaves, each assigned to specific duties that kept the grand machinery of aristocratic life running smoothly. Household slaves stoked the fires, swept the atriums, polished marble floors, prepared meals, dressed their masters, and attended their every need. Some were personal attendants who followed their masters throughout the day, pouring wine at banquets, carrying letters, or running errands across the city. On the surface, this might appear to be the better lot. Household slaves often ate the leftovers from their masters' meals and had shelter inside the villa walls. They witnessed the rhythms of elite Roman life, the baths, the banquets, the poetry recitals. Some even learned refined manners and speech, imitating the habits of their owners. But proximity to luxury was no guarantee of kindness. In fact, being close to the master meant being constantly under scrutiny. A single mistake, a wine cup spilled, a garment torn, a misheard command, could provoke sudden violence. Some masters struck their slaves with fists or whips for the slightest error. Others inflicted crueler punishments, burning with hot irons, mutilation, or confinement in tiny cells. The Roman writer Seneca, himself a wealthy man, described how some aristocrats delighted in creative punishments, treating their slaves not as people, but as canvases for cruelty. And there was no privacy. You might sleep on the floor outside your master's bedroom, ready to spring up at a word. You could be summoned at midnight to fetch water, at dawn to scrub floors, at noon to prepare a feast. Exhaustion was constant, yet rest was never secure. If household service carried constant vigilance, agricultural labor demanded constant suffering. Rome's vast estates, or latifundia, were the empire's breadbasket. These sprawling farms, often owned by senators or equestrians, were worked by gangs of chained slaves under the watch of ruthless overseers. The agricultural writer Columella described how slaves were divided into groups, each tasked with planting, harvesting, tending vines, or caring for livestock. Overseers carried whips and did not hesitate to use them. Slaves were shackled at night in barracks, their ankles bound with iron to prevent escape. Conditions were brutal. Under the scorching Italian sun or the rocky soils of Sicily, men and women labored from dawn until dusk. Diet was meager, coarse bread, thin porridge, sometimes olives or beans if the overseer was merciful. Malnutrition and disease were rampant. Medical care was practically non-existent. If a slave collapsed, they might be beaten for laziness. If they died, they were replaced with another captive from Rome's endless conquests. To the estate owner, slaves were expendable, like oxen that could be purchased anew. The philosopher Varro classified slaves alongside animals and tools, referring to them as instrumentum vocale, speaking tools. That phrase alone captures the essence of agricultural slavery. You were not seen as human, but as a plough that groaned instead of squeaked, a cart that bled instead of splintered. For many, the agricultural fields were a death sentence. Life expectancy was short, often only a handful of years. Quarries and mines were even worse, pits of despair where men labored until their bodies gave out, buried in dust, darkness, and exhaustion. Roman historians rarely even recorded their existence, as if the dead there were unworthy of memory. In Rome itself, slaves were everywhere. The city's population of nearly 1 million depended on their labor. Urban slaves could be seen carrying their masters in litters through crowded streets, hauling amphorae of wine, or standing at market stalls as assistants. Some were scribes or accountants, running their masters' business affairs. Others were cooks, bakers, or doorkeepers, stationed at the entrance of villas to greet visitors. Rome's public baths, the hub of social life, relied on armies of slaves to stoke furnaces, fetch towels, and oil bathers' skin. Wealthy women often traveled with entire entourages of slave attendants who dressed them, styled their hair, and held parasols to shield them from the sun. But living in the city brought its own dangers. Runaways faced brutal punishment if caught, often branded on the forehead with the letters FUG, fugitivus. Some masters made examples of rebellious slaves by chaining them to the millstone, forcing them to grind grain endlessly under the eyes of passers-by. Others sent them to the infamous ergastula, underground prison barracks, where chains, darkness, and despair crushed any thought of escape. And the threat of sexual exploitation loomed constantly. Female slaves in particular were vulnerable, used as concubines or forced into prostitution by their masters. Consent was meaningless. A slave's body was another form of property to be used at will. For men, too, sexual abuse was not uncommon, though Roman culture cloaked it in silence. What united all slaves, whether in villa, field, or city, was fear. Fear of punishment, fear of betrayal, fear of arbitrary cruelty. Masters held absolute power over life and death. Roman law, the dominium, recognized slaves as property, meaning a master could kill them without legal repercussion. And this fear was not just individual, but collective. If one slave killed a master, all slaves in the household could be executed, regardless of guilt. This collective punishment ensured obedience through terror, for each slave became responsible for the loyalty of all. In 61 CE, when the senator Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one of his slaves, the Senate ordered the execution of his entire household, 400 slaves, men, women, and children alike. The outcry in Rome was enormous, but the executions went forward. To the Senate, the message was clear: masters must never fear their slaves. Punishments, the fear that ruled every breath. If slavery in Rome was built on the foundation of conquest and labor, its mortar was fear. To be a slave was not just to work, but to live with the constant, gnawing terror of punishment. Every glance from a master, every hesitation in your duty, every whisper of disobedience carried the possibility of violence. The punishments were not merely corrective, they were designed to instill dread, to break wills, to ensure that the thought of resistance died before it could even take root. Under Roman law, the master held near total authority over his slaves. The legal concept of dominium granted him ownership in the fullest sense. He could buy, sell, gift, lease, punish, and even kill his slave without fear of legal repercussion. A Roman citizen might be protected by the rights of appeal, trial, and law. A slave had none of these. To the courts, you were property, and property could not demand justice. This meant that punishments varied wildly, depending not on the crime, but on the temperament of the master. Some men prided themselves on clemency, punishing lightly or sparingly. Others were sadists who delighted in creative cruelty. A spilled cup of wine in one household might mean a scolding. In another, it could mean a lashing so severe it left scars for life. To live as a slave was to live in a constant state of uncertainty, where even obedience offered no shield. The most common punishment was the lash. Roman households kept whips, rods, and scourges readily available, and their crack was as much a part of daily life as the ringing of bells. A lazy worker, a tardy servant, or even a slave who simply failed to appear cheerful enough could find themselves bound and beaten. Some masters preferred public whippings, conducted in front of other slaves as a warning. The overseer's whip did not just strike the flesh of one slave, it lashed across the minds of all who watched, reminding them of their vulnerability. Slaves were sometimes forced to beat each other, a perverse tactic that sowed distrust and fractured solidarity. The historian Seneca recounts attending a banquet where a nobleman casually ordered a slave flogged for serving lukewarm water. The punishment itself was not unusual. What struck Seneca was the indifference with which it was given, as if whipping a man until he bled were no different than swatting an insect. That casual cruelty was Rome's truest terror. Violence was normalized, woven into the daily rhythms of life. Some punishments were designed not just to hurt, but to permanently mark. Runaways, when recaptured, were often branded on the forehead with the letters FUG, short for fugitivus, runaway. This scar was both punishment and advertisement, ensuring that everyone who saw you knew your shame. Others might be tattooed with derogatory inscriptions, their bodies transformed into living warnings. In harsher cases, slaves had tendons severed, feet crushed, or hamstrings cut to prevent future escape attempts. Castration was not unheard of, particularly for those forced into service in households where masters feared sexual temptation. These mutilations were not simply physical restraints, but psychological ones, erasing dignity and hope along with the body. If branding marked you and the whip tormented you, crucifixion annihilated you. This was the slave's death, the punishment most dreaded, the fate held in reserve for the most serious offenses: rebellion, violence against a master, or organized escape. Crucifixion was never quick. Victims were flogged, stripped, and forced to carry the wooden crossbeam, patibulum, through the streets in humiliation. They were then nailed or tied to the cross and left to hang until death, a process that could take hours or even days as the body slowly collapsed under its own weight. Death came through exhaustion, asphyxiation, or shock. But crucifixion was not only execution, it was theatre. Crucifixions were performed publicly, on roadsides or hills, where passers-by could not ignore them. The message was unmistakable: this is the price of defiance. After the Spartacus revolt in 71 BCE, the Roman general Crassus ordered 6,000 slaves crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies stretched across the 120-mile road from Capua to Rome. Travelers walking that route passed an unbroken line of agony, a corridor of human suffering meant to sear fear into every heart. The phrase "abi in malum crucem," go to a bad cross, became a common Roman insult, so familiar that the image of crucifixion was embedded in everyday speech. For Romans, crucifixion was more than a punishment. It was the embodiment of total subjugation. What made Roman slavery uniquely cruel was not just individual punishment, but collective punishment. If a slave killed his master, every slave in the household could be executed, regardless of innocence. The most infamous case occurred in 61 CE. The senator Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one of his slaves. By law, all 400 slaves in his household were condemned to death. Citizens of Rome protested the decision, horrified at the indiscriminate slaughter, but the Senate stood firm. Order demanded fear, and fear demanded obedience. The mass execution was carried out, the blood of hundreds spilling not because they were guilty, but because they were slaves. This principle was brutally effective. If you were a slave, you were not only responsible for yourself, but for every other slave in your household. Any thought of rebellion meant not only your death, but the death of your friends, your family, even your children. Rome ensured that solidarity among slaves was poisoned with fear of collective reprisal. Some masters, particularly emperors, turned punishments into performance. Slaves might be forced into the arena not as gladiators, but as victims, executed by beasts in a spectacle called damnatio ad bestias. Imagine being dressed in mythological costume and thrown to lions or bears before a cheering crowd. For the spectators, it was entertainment. For the condemned, it was horror. Nero, infamous for his cruelty, delighted in turning executions into grotesque theatre. Suetonius records that he once forced a slave to reenact the myth of Icarus, strapping him with makeshift wings and pushing him from a great height. The man plummeted to his death, his body splattering near the imperial box as Nero laughed. Others were forced to play Orpheus, sent into the arena with a lyre to soothe the beasts. The animals listened briefly, then tore the man apart. These punishments were not simply meant to end lives, they were meant to send messages. To slaves, the message was obedience or annihilation. To the public, it was Rome's unchallenged dominance. To the masters, it was amusement, a cruel luxury afforded by absolute power. The small hopes, paths to freedom. If fear was the whip that drove Roman slavery, hope was the faint candle that kept many alive. However cruel and crushing the system, Rome dangled before its slaves a single, glittering possibility: freedom. Rare, difficult, and often dependent on the whim of a master, manumission, the act of being freed, was the thread of light woven into an otherwise dark tapestry. It was the hope that allowed some to endure whips and chains, the dream that turned endless toil into a gamble for tomorrow. But the truth of this freedom was far more complex, for it carried new obligations, new struggles, and new forms of dependency. The Romans were unusual in how often they freed slaves. Unlike some societies where slavery was permanent and absolute, Rome built into its system a mechanism of release. A master could grant freedom through formal ceremony, by inscription in a will, or even by a casual declaration in front of witnesses. A slave who had served faithfully for years might be rewarded with manumission as a gesture of gratitude or piety. But this was not purely benevolence. Freed slaves, called liberty freedmen, still owed deep loyalty to their former masters, now known as patrons. The bond between them was cemented in the ritual of manumissio, a public acknowledgement that, although free, the slave's life remained tied to the master's household. The freedman was expected to visit his patron regularly, offer services, and contribute financially if called upon. In this sense, manumission was not escape from slavery, but transformation into a different kind of obligation. For some, freedom was not a gift, but a purchase. Skilled slaves, artisans, scribes, tutors, merchants, were sometimes allowed to keep a fraction of their earnings, a peculium, essentially a personal savings account. Over years, a clever or fortunate slave could accumulate enough to buy their freedom from their master. This required cunning. You had to remain obedient enough to avoid punishment, skilled enough to earn money, and lucky enough to persuade your master to accept the offer. Many masters resisted, preferring the steady labor of a slave over the one-time payment of manumission. Others encouraged it, seeing it as profitable. They could sell a slave's freedom at a high price and then retain them as a loyal freedman. Imagine the long years of saving, hiding coins earned from extra work, bartering favors, quietly building the fund that might one day buy your life. Each copper coin would carry with it a surge of hope. And yet, even at the end, the decision lay not with you, but with your master. He could deny your request, he could raise the price, he could simply refuse, and all your years of saving would collapse into despair. For those who achieved manumission, life changed drastically. A freedman was no longer property. He could marry legally, own land, start businesses, and even accumulate wealth. Many did. Rome's bustling economy provided opportunities for freedmen to rise, sometimes spectacularly. Some freedmen became wealthy merchants, ship owners, or contractors. Others entered imperial service, where loyalty and skill could elevate them into positions of astonishing influence. The Emperor Claudius, in particular, relied heavily on freedmen advisors. His secretary Narcissus and his finance minister Pallas, both former slaves, wielded power so great that senators gritted their teeth as they bowed to men once branded as property. Yet freedom had its limits. Freedmen were barred from holding high political office, and social prejudice clung to them like a shadow. Aristocrats sneered at their origins, mocking them as ex-slaves no matter how rich or successful they became. Their children, however, born free, could rise further, sometimes entering the very ranks of the elite. For many, this generational hope, that their children might live as citizens untainted by slavery, was the greatest reward of all. But for every Narcissus or Pallas who rose to prominence, thousands of freedmen lived lives barely distinguishable from slavery. Obligations to patrons could be suffocating. A freedman was expected to accompany his patron in public, to vote as he instructed, to offer services without pay. A master could manumit a slave precisely to ensure he had a client bound by law and gratitude, gaining political support without the cost of maintaining a household servant. In many cases, freedmen continued working in the very same roles they had as slaves, managing shops, tending workshops, tutoring children. The difference was legal status, not lifestyle. To some, this was enough. They could no longer be beaten at whim or sold on the market. But for others, freedom without independence felt like a hollow victory. From the perspective of the Roman elite, manumission was not merely generosity but strategy. By offering the possibility of freedom, masters encouraged obedience. A slave who dreamed of release might endure years of suffering in silence, clinging to the hope that loyalty would be rewarded. Hope was a leash, softer than chains but just as binding. This is perhaps why Rome, unlike some other ancient societies, freed slaves with relative frequency. The system of manumission was a safety valve, preventing despair from boiling into revolt. It offered slaves just enough possibility of change to keep them striving within the system rather than tearing it down. History preserves glimpses of these hopes and struggles. The poet Horace, beloved of Augustus, was the son of a freedman. His rise to literary fame was a living testament to the generational ladder that manumission could provide. But for every Horace, there were countless nameless slaves who died with freedom forever out of reach. Inscriptions across Rome reveal epitaphs of freedmen celebrating their status. Here lies Marcus Tullius Felix, once a slave, now free. To us, it may seem small. To them, it was monumental, to be remembered not as property but as a person. Yet even in death, the shadow of slavery remained. Many freedmen chose to be buried near their patrons, their tombs testifying not just to their independence but to the bond they could never escape. Their freedom was real, but it was also a reminder of the chains they once wore. Specialized slave roles, from gladiators to tutors. Not all slaves in Rome toiled in chains beneath the sun or swept marble floors under their master's gaze. Some were pushed into roles so specialized, so unique, that they stood apart from the ordinary drudgery of slavery. These slaves occupied positions that brought them close to power, culture, or spectacle, and yet their fates were no less precarious. For in Rome, no matter how rare your skill or how dazzling your talent, you remained property, useful today, disposable tomorrow. Perhaps the most famous specialized slaves were the gladiators, men whose bodies became instruments of entertainment in Rome's arenas. Many were prisoners of war or criminals condemned to fight, but thousands were slaves purchased specifically for the gladiatorial schools, or ludi. Life as a gladiator was brutal, but it was not always the shortest path to death. Gladiators were valuable investments. A skilled fighter could become a star, earning fame and even the admiration of the Roman crowd. Some were so popular that their images appeared in graffiti, women swooned over them, and emperors themselves cheered for their victories. But all of this glamour masked the harsh reality. Every fight carried the risk of mutilation or death, and every victory postponed but did not erase the inevitability of destruction. Consider the case of Spartacus, once a Thracian soldier captured and enslaved, who became a gladiator in Capua. His rebellion against Rome in 73 BCE would terrify the Republic, but before his revolt, he endured the grueling discipline of the arena, training in weapons, enduring beatings from instructors, learning to fight not just for survival, but for spectacle. For gladiators, the crowd's roar determined your worth, and sometimes your life. A fallen fighter could be spared if the audience raised their thumbs, or slaughtered if they demanded blood. To be a gladiator was to live at the mercy of a mob's whim, and yet some slaves dreamed of the arena. Compared to the grinding misery of the fields, gladiatorial fame, however fleeting, offered recognition. You were still a slave, but for a brief moment you could become a name remembered in the chants of Rome. While gladiators gave their blood, another class of slaves gave their minds. Rome's conquest of Greece had flooded the empire with educated captives, philosophers, teachers, physicians, and scribes. These men and women became prized possessions of wealthy Roman households. Greek slaves, in particular, were sought after as tutors for the children of the elite. A wealthy senator might boast of owning a slave who could quote Homer from memory, instruct his son in rhetoric, or teach his daughter music. These slaves often lived in closer quarters with their masters, sharing in their intellectual world. Some were treated with respect, even affection, but the leash of ownership was never loosened. Imagine the humiliation: to be a philosopher in Athens, revered for wisdom, and then suddenly find yourself in Rome, compelled to tutor the spoiled son of a senator who could strike or dismiss you at will. You might dine at your master's table, but only as an ornament, proof of his wealth and culture. The paradox is stark. Slaves like these shaped Roman culture, transmitting Greek philosophy, literature, and science to the empire, yet their own voices were silenced by bondage. Even the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, whose teachings on freedom and virtue endure to this day, began life as a slave. His master once twisted his leg so violently that it broke, leaving him crippled. Epictetus is said to have calmly remarked, "If you continue, you will break it." When it snapped, he added, "Did I not tell you so?" His philosophy was born in chains. At the highest end of the spectrum were the imperial slaves, those owned not by ordinary citizens, but by the emperor himself. These men and women managed palaces, finances, correspondence, and ceremonies. They were the silent machinery behind the glittering facade of imperial power. Some became astonishingly influential. Imperial freedmen, in particular, rose to positions where they controlled access to the emperor, managed vast estates, and commanded armies of other slaves. During the reign of Claudius, freedmen like Narcissus and Pallas wielded power that rivaled senators, directing the flow of imperial policy from behind the throne. But their power was always precarious. Imperial politics were a treacherous game, and freedmen who fell out of favor could be exiled, imprisoned, or executed. Their fortunes rose and fell with the shifting winds of court intrigue. The higher a slave or freedman climbed, the greater the danger of the fall. For ordinary imperial slaves, the tasks were more menial, polishing marble halls, tending gardens, preparing lavish feasts for state banquets. Yet even these roles placed them in proximity to the emperor, a reminder of how deeply slavery was woven into the very heart of Roman rule. Perhaps the most hidden, yet most pervasive specialized role was sexual slavery. Roman masters, both male and female, had absolute control over the bodies of their slaves. Consent did not exist. Female slaves in particular were vulnerable to exploitation as concubines, companions, or prostitutes. Male slaves, too, were not exempt. Masters used them without shame, and Roman society largely accepted such practices as the prerogative of ownership. Some slaves were purchased specifically for sexual use, chosen for beauty rather than skill. Others were forced into brothels, their earnings flowing directly to their owners. This form of slavery was rarely recorded in grand histories, yet it was widespread, a silent reality of Rome's system of domination. The scars were not only physical, but psychological. To be reduced to nothing more than a body used at will was a violation that eroded identity more thoroughly than whips or chains. It was slavery at its most intimate and devastating. Specialized slaves occupied a strange position. A gladiator could be adored by crowds, yet executed on a whim. A tutor could shape the minds of Rome's elite, yet still be struck like a servant. An imperial freedman could wield the power of an emperor, yet be cut down by rivals. A concubine might be lavished with gifts, yet discarded without warning. In every case, the paradox remained. Skill or beauty might raise your value, but never your status. A slave could be useful, respected, even loved, but never free until granted manumission. Rome allowed slaves to climb ladders of influence, but the rungs were greased with the knowledge that you could be dragged back into the dirt at any moment. Slave revolts and rebellions when chains snapped. For all Rome's cruelty, for all its whips and crosses, for all the fear it instilled, slaves were still human beings. And human beings do not endure chains forever. From time to time, Rome's slaves snapped the fetters of fear and rose in defiance. Their rebellions were desperate, brutal, and doomed more often than not. Yet they stand as thunderclaps in Roman history, moments when the empire's might trembled before the fury of the enslaved. Not every revolt began with grand armies or banners raised against Rome. Many started with small sparks, a band of slaves overpowering an overseer, a handful of runaways attacking a patrol, or a household conspiracy uncovered before it bloomed. Rome's records are littered with whispers of plots, suppressed uprisings, and swift punishments. These small acts of rebellion terrified Roman masters precisely because they proved how fragile control could be. For every 100 slaves on a farm, there might be only a handful of overseers. In numbers, the slaves had strength, only fear kept them divided. If that fear faltered, the balance tipped. The first great slave uprising erupted not in Rome itself, but in Sicily, the grain basket of the Republic. In 135 BCE, under the leadership of a Syrian slave named Eunice, thousands of slaves rose against their masters. Eunice claimed to be a prophet, spitting sparks of fire from his mouth as a sign of divine power, a theatrical trick that nonetheless inspired thousands. He promised freedom, vengeance, and a new order. Armed at first with farm tools and stolen weapons, the rebels grew into a formidable force. They seized towns, defeated Roman militias, and for a time controlled vast swathes of the island. At their height, they numbered nearly 200,000, a staggering army of the enslaved. But discipline frayed, resources dwindled, and Rome responded with overwhelming force. By 132 BCE, the rebellion was crushed. Eunice himself was captured and died in prison. Yet Sicily was not done. In 104 BCE, another revolt exploded, this time under a slave named Salvius, who declared himself King Tryphon. Again, tens of thousands rallied, seizing cities and holding out for years. Again, Rome responded with brutal campaigns, slaughtering rebels by the tens of thousands. Sicily's fields, once fertile with grain, were drenched in blood. The Sicilian revolts revealed the terrifying potential of slave armies. Rome depended on Sicily's grain to feed its people. If slaves could seize the island, they could starve the capital itself. The Republic had been warned. Slavery was not just an economic system, but a powder keg waiting for a spark. But it was Spartacus who ignited the greatest and most famous of all slave revolts. In 73 BCE, a group of about 70 gladiators broke free from a training school in Capua. Armed with kitchen knives and stolen weapons, they overpowered their guards and fled to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Among them was a Thracian named Spartacus, once a soldier, now a slave, destined for the arena. His leadership, charisma, and tactical brilliance transformed a desperate escape into a full-scale rebellion. At first, Rome dismissed them as a nuisance, but the rebels swelled in number as slaves from farms and estates flocked to their banner. Soon, Spartacus commanded an army of 70,000 men and women, gladiators, slaves, deserters, even free peasants crushed by poverty. They fought not just for survival, but for freedom, and they defeated Roman armies again and again. Spartacus proved a master of guerrilla warfare. On Mount Vesuvius, when Roman forces trapped him, he and his men climbed down the cliffs using vines, ambushed the enemy camp, and slaughtered them. His army swept across southern Italy, plundering estates, freeing slaves, and defeating consular legions. At one point, Spartacus sought passage to Sicily, hoping to spark another great uprising there, but betrayal and logistical failure forced him to remain on the mainland. For 2 years, the Republic reeled. Senators whispered in fear. Roman generals suffered humiliating defeats. Some wondered if Spartacus might march on Rome itself. His army represented everything the Republic dreaded: the inversion of order, the vengeance of the oppressed, the nightmare of a society built on slavery turned against itself. But Rome was patient, and Rome was ruthless. In 71 BCE, the wealthy general Marcus Licinius Crassus took command. He restored discipline to the legions, reviving the ancient punishment of decimation, executing every 10th soldier of units that fled in battle. With fear as his weapon, he forged an army determined to crush Spartacus once and for all. The final battle was fought in southern Italy. Spartacus, realizing defeat was inevitable, is said to have cut his way through enemy lines, seeking Crassus himself, hoping to kill the general in single combat. He was surrounded and slain, his body never found. The survivors fared worse. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies stretching in an unbroken line from Capua to Rome, a grotesque gallery of agony meant to ensure that no slave would ever again dare such defiance. After Spartacus, Rome never forgot the danger of mass revolt. Laws grew harsher, punishments more severe. Masters tightened surveillance. The Senate declared that any hint of conspiracy must be crushed without hesitation. Fear, already the slave's constant companion, deepened further. And yet, the memory of Spartacus lived on. Romans themselves could not entirely erase him. Historians like Plutarch and Appian recorded his deeds with a mixture of fear and admiration. Centuries later, his name would echo as a symbol of resistance against oppression, long after the crosses of the Appian Way had rotted. Slave revolts after Spartacus were smaller, scattered, and swiftly extinguished. Rome's lesson had been too brutal, its deterrence too overwhelming. Still, resistance never vanished. Runaway bands haunted forests, conspiracies brewed in shadows, and masters lived with the unease that their own servants might one day rise against them. In truth, the rarity of large-scale revolts was not because slaves lacked the will to resist, but because Rome had perfected the art of control: divide them, terrify them, tempt them with the dream of manumission. Slaves might outnumber citizens in some regions, but unity was nearly impossible under the weight of fear and false hope. So, if you were a slave in Rome, would you risk rebellion? Would you flee with nothing but the clothes on your back, knowing capture meant branding or crucifixion? Would you take up arms, following Spartacus into battle, gambling your life for the faint chance of victory? Or would you stay, endure, and dream of freedom granted by your master's hand? The revolts of Rome reveal a truth as old as humanity. Chains can bind the body, but not forever. At times, the will to be free burns hotter than the fear of death, and when it does, even the might of Rome trembles. Rome's economy of flesh, why the empire needed slaves. Slavery in Rome was not an accident of conquest, nor a marginal feature of society. It was the very backbone of the Roman world. From the humblest farm to the glittering palaces of emperors, from the bustling markets of the Forum to the armies marching across continents, slavery was everywhere, a silent engine that powered Rome's greatness. To understand Rome's economy is to understand that it was an economy built not only on land, trade, and conquest, but on flesh. Agriculture was the lifeblood of Rome. The empire's wealth flowed from the soil: wheat from Sicily and Egypt, olives from Hispania, grapes from Italy, livestock from Gaul. And who worked these fields? Slaves. The latifundia, vast estates owned by senators and wealthy aristocrats, consumed tens of thousands of slave laborers. Shackled gangs tilled the soil from dawn until dusk, watched by overseers with whips. They planted, pruned, harvested, and pressed, producing the grain, oil, and wine that fed the Roman world. Unlike small farms run by free peasants, latifundia operated like factories of flesh. Slaves were cheaper than wages, and conquest ensured a steady supply. In times of military victory, markets overflowed with captives, driving prices down. A single campaign in Gaul or the East might yield tens of thousands of new slaves, funneled into the countryside to replace those broken by labor. This system reshaped Italian society. Free farmers, unable to compete with the low cost of slave labor, were pushed off their land, swelling the cities with unemployed poor. Rome's famous bread and circuses policy, grain handouts and public games, was not just generosity, but necessity to pacify the growing urban masses displaced by the dominance of slave estates. Slavery did not stop at the farm. Rome's cities pulsed with slave labor. Bakers, butchers, fullers, and craftsmen often worked alongside or were entirely composed of slaves. Workshops, officinae, were filled with enslaved artisans producing textiles, pottery, metalwork, and luxury goods. In the bustling ports of Ostia and Puteoli, slaves unloaded ships, hauled amphorae, and managed warehouses. Merchants often used slave agents to conduct transactions, some trusted with significant sums of money. Slaves served as secretaries, accountants, and managers, running businesses they could never own. Even the entertainment industry ran on slavery. Gladiators, actors, musicians, and dancers were often slaves, their talents exploited for profit and spectacle. In some cases, skilled performers could earn fame, wealth, and even manumission. But until then, their bodies belonged to their masters, their talents monetized in theaters and arenas. Every elite Roman household was an economic machine powered by slaves. A wealthy senator might own hundreds, each with a designated role: cooks, gardeners, hairdressers, doorkeepers, scribes, tutors, and bodyguards. Slaves ran kitchens, managed storerooms, and accompanied masters in public. These households functioned as microeconomies. A master's prestige was measured not just by wealth, but by the number and quality of his slaves. A man attended by a retinue of educated Greek tutors or beautiful attendants displayed power in human form. To walk the streets with 20 slaves trailing behind was a living advertisement of wealth. Even ordinary Romans, if they had modest means, might own 1 or 2 slaves, often considered essential for social respectability. A Roman citizen without a slave was seen as poor indeed. Thus, slavery was not confined to the upper crust. It permeated every level of society. Rome itself, the state, the city, the empire, relied on slaves. Public slaves, owned by the government, maintained roads, aqueducts, sewers, and public buildings. They staffed temples, serving priests and cults. They worked as clerks in the bureaucracy, copying documents, maintaining archives, and keeping accounts. In some cases, public slaves rose to respected positions, wielding authority over other workers despite their status. But they remained the property of the state, their labor feeding the machinery of empire. The Roman military too used slave labor. Slaves accompanied armies as baggage carriers, camp workers, and even combatants in desperate moments. They built fortifications, dug ditches, and transported supplies, ensuring legions could march unburdened into battle. Rome's appetite for slaves was fueled by conquest, and conquest was fueled by slaves. Each campaign brought new captives who were sold at auction to fund the state, enrich generals, and supply estates. Victorious armies marched home not only with plundered gold, but with human spoils, who became both symbols of triumph and tools of production. Consider Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul. Ancient sources claim he enslaved nearly 1 million people, flooding the markets of Rome with cheap labor. Prices for slaves plummeted during such times, making it possible for even modest Romans to buy. The expansion of the empire was a cycle. Conquest created slaves, slaves fueled the economy, and the wealth generated financed further conquest. But what happened when conquest slowed? In the later empire, as Rome's expansion waned, the steady influx of slaves declined. The system, built on a constant flow of human bodies, began to strain. Masters turned to breeding slaves domestically, encouraging slave families, though this was less efficient than conquest. In some cases, poor free peasants found themselves in conditions little different from slavery, bound to the land in what would later evolve into serfdom. The decline in fresh slave supply weakened Rome's economic model. The empire had grown addicted to cheap labor, and when that labor faltered, cracks appeared. Some historians argue that Rome's dependency on slavery was both its strength and its weakness, a system that made the empire powerful but also inflexible, unable to adapt when the conquests ended. For Romans, the economics of slavery was not merely practical, it was moralized. Writers like Varro and Columella treated slaves as investments, discussing them in the same breath as cattle or tools. A slave was a speaking tool, an asset to be calculated, maintained, and replaced as needed. Yet others, like Seneca, recognized the hypocrisy. "They are slaves," some said. "No," Seneca replied. "They are men." But even Seneca, who urged kindness, owned slaves himself. The system was so deeply embedded in Roman life that even critics could not fully imagine its end. And so, once again, the question turns to you. Imagine yourself as a cog in this machine of flesh. Would you labor in the fields, producing grain for the city? Would you toil in workshops, your craft enriching a master who never lifted a hand? Would you walk in a master's retinue, an ornament of prestige, valued more for appearance than humanity? Rome's greatness, its roads, its aqueducts, its theatres, its armies, was built on the backs of slaves. Every stone of the Colosseum, every loaf of bread in the Forum, every coin minted with an emperor's face bore the invisible mark of enslaved hands. Rome prided itself on freedom, the freedom of its citizens, but that freedom was purchased by the bondage of millions. So, we return to you. Step into the sandals of a Roman slave. Feel the dust of the fields on your skin, the sting of the whip on your back, the roar of the arena in your ears. Could you endure it? Could you last long enough to win freedom, or would you break beneath the weight of Rome's chains? Most would not. Few did. For every freedman's tombstone, for every gladiator remembered in graffiti, for every philosopher who wrote in chains, there were countless more who vanished nameless into the soil of Rome's fields, into the silence of its households, into the dust of its arenas. Would you survive? Perhaps, but more likely, Rome would swallow you whole, as it did millions. And yet, even if you did not survive, your suffering would not be in vain, for in every whispered prayer, in every act of defiance, in every scar left behind, the humanity of Rome's slaves endured. Rome may have tried to make them property, but history remembers them as people, people who lived, suffered, fought, and, in their own way, survived.